Okay, so it is 2:15. I know that some people are still going to be joining the panel, but I'd like to get started on time this afternoon, as I know there are other panels that people want to attend, and Ghazal is going to have to leave us a little bit before the end. So I want to make sure we get started right away while people continue to join. So hello and welcome to our panel on AI bias. My name is Susannah Torpey. I am co-chair of Winston's Tech Antitrust Group and a litigation partner. I will also be your moderator for this panel today. Please note that this panel is being recorded. Although the audience has been placed on mute, we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A box on the right side of your screen at any time during the discussion. Please direct your questions to me, Susannah Torpey, so I can try to sift through them and get them to our wonderful panelists today. We'll try to respond to all of your questions at the end of the presentation, but for any that go unanswered due to time, we'll do our best to follow up with you after the panel. For those of you seeking CLE credit, we'll share a CLE code, of course, midway through the presentation. Please save the code and enter it into the CLE evaluation form that's now available on the CLE page of the event site. The CLE form will also be circulated in a follow-up email to all attendees. So now turning to introduce our fantastic panelists today. Joining me, we're very honored to have with us Peter Turk, who serves as Senior Counsel at Change Healthcare and focuses on AI and platform. Peter has a particular focus towards building an anti-bias program and building policies for development teams to bridge AI. Prior to this, he spent several years with Amazon Web Services as a senior corporate counsel with the products team. During his time at AWS, he supported the development and operation of a wide range of AI and machine learning products and services and provided counsel on general privacy and data-related matters. From IBM, we have Anjelica Dortch, who serves as a technology policy executive, where she focuses on policy priorities for responsible artificial intelligence, intellectual property, and cloud computing. Prior to joining IBM, Anjelica spent 10 years working for a variety of federal agencies, including being a senior technology advisor in the White House, where she led coordination of several tech initiatives, including the National Cyber Strategy, the U.S. Federal Cloud Computing Strategy, and the administration's report on artificial intelligence. From Cash App at Square, we have Ghazal Niazi, who serves as a senior product counsel. Her work focuses on cryptocurrency implementation and peer-to-peer payments, among other things. Previously, she was a product counsel and tax counsel at Amazon Web Services, where she supported AI and machine learning teams, including teams working on features designed to reduce bias in AI systems. And from Alegion, we have Dr. Cheryl Martin, who has built AI and machine learning applications throughout her career in software engineering and data science. Previously, she was a research scientist at the University of Texas at Austin. She has worked across a variety of domains, including cybersecurity, natural language processing, and computer vision. So thank you so much to all of us, our wonderful panelists joining us today. So thank you for joining us as well. Today, we will be discussing what we call the AI bias paradox. One of the most exciting opportunities associated with AI is the ability to reach underserved populations with new tools and products that previously were only available to those who could pay for individualized services. However, the promise of AI has been restrained by AI bias. Concerns regarding racial, gender, economic biases have surfaced in all types of applications varied across hiring, policing, healthcare, judicial sentencing, and financial services, among others. If your data is biased from the start, your results will be as well. However, there is still potential for AI to have a low error rate compared to humans if coded properly. Today, we will discuss legal and technical strategies that can be used to mitigate algorithmic bias. So for those who might not be familiar with these issues, Ghazal, I'm hoping you can please start by explaining what algorithmic bias is and help level set our discussion today.
Thank you, Susannah. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Pleasure being here. At the highest level, when we say algorithmic or AI bias, what we're really referring to are AI systems that make predictions or generate outputs that are systematically unfair to certain groups of people. So you may be asking yourself, how do these bias issues arise? Well, focusing on algorithmic bias specifically, these issues may arise where the underlying models or algorithms are actually trained on biased data. Susannah, you alluded to this earlier. If the data underrepresents, for example, certain features such as gender, age, nationality, or the like, the resulting algorithm could also disproportionately impact predicted outcomes across those features. Another interesting thing to consider here is model explainability. This presents another challenge for practitioners in this space, particularly as more complicated and complex models are released into production. Explainability generally refers to whether a human being could reasonably determine how the AI model or the algorithm generated certain predictions. If you kind of think about it, historically, it's been a little bit of a black box or a monolith, figuring out how models actually generate predictions. The technology is getting better today. And so we're in a much better position to figure out how the model is generating outputs. And in that way, explainability does help engineers and data scientists determine whether their models are biased, and then they can engage in additional remediation tactics to address the bias.
Great, thank you so much, Ghazal. Now, before we can propose solutions, of course, we must first understand the problem. And I'm sure that everyone listening here today would rather not wait to find out that there is a problem after their customers come back and review their products. So for those of us without a data scientist background, Cheryl, can you please tell us, how can we even know that our models are biased to begin with?
Sure, thank you. Once you've identified the ethical considerations that are relevant to your particular use case, the technical aspects of determining whether a model is biased relate to model explainability, as Ghazal mentioned. You not only want to be able to explain forensically why a particular decision was made, but also understand before you put the model into the real world for use, what it will do in various situations that could demonstrate bias. And there are three main approaches to determining what a model will do. There's structural, experiential, and behavioral approaches. The best way to explain the structural approach is with an analogy to understanding human thought processes by studying brain function. A structural approach is like using an MRI of a human brain while they're thinking about something to determine what they're thinking. Different parts of the brain will light up when it is doing different things. And the same thing is true for a complex AI neural network-based model. This is an extremely powerful approach, and it is an active area of research, both for AI models and for human psychology. The second approach is experiential, which is analogous to explaining human behavior by looking at their past experiences. For an AI model, this is the training data. You can use standard statistical analysis on the training data itself to identify the patterns that the AI model will reflect. And if that data exhibits bias, the model will reflect the same patterns. And finally, there is a behavioral approach, which is analogous to testing what behavior a human actually does when put in various situations. And this is a great place for legal and data science teams to work together to design a battery of tests for the AI models to demonstrate balanced versus biased behavior. For most things, the combination of these approaches is often the best idea, but you should always start by looking at your training data. I've taught some classes specifically about detecting and mitigating bias that arises from training data in AI models. And in these classes, I distinguish three types of training data bias. The first relates to data set composition, which Ghazal referred to, and making sure that the data distributions represent the actual population that you'll be applying the model to. The second is measurement error that can systematically distort individual values in the data. And the third is actually prejudicial bias, where the historical data, even if it's measured accurately and it distributed in accordance with the actual population where the model is going to be used, it actually runs counter to the decisions that are deemed should be made by legal counsel based on ethical or other considerations. And so there are specific techniques for addressing each of these types of bias, and some of these areas are still very much active areas of research.
Thank you so much. So it sounds like every company that is working with AI is going to have to overcome certain challenges. Ghazal and Cheryl, what challenges should companies just expect as a matter of course to have to overcome when trying to mitigate AI bias?
Yeah, at the highest level, I think this goes back to what Cheryl and I were just pointing out earlier in the conversation. Really, the AI systems are only as good as the data that you feed them, right? And so in this way, having access to diverse data sets that can be used to train AI models can really help address the types of algorithmic bias that we're concerned about at the source. Today, I mean, most companies are responsible for sourcing data themselves, right? Either they go out and license the data from customers or third parties, or they scour the internet for public data sets. The trouble with public data sets, although they're readily available, is that they may have inherent deficiencies from a bias and diversity perspective, because generally speaking, we don't know why those, well, you might be cued in as to why those data sets were compiled, but you don't know the techniques or the methods or the sample size generally on how those data sets were put together. And this becomes especially important when you're talking about facial recognition applications. And when this is the only real, readily available data out there for data scientists and engineers at companies to use to train models, it becomes really, really difficult and thorny issue for companies to address. Now, that being said, efforts are definitely underway at companies to source the most diverse data sets possible. But there is an enormous opportunity for government actors like NIST to step up and really take a more active role in this and release diverse data sets that companies can use in an unrestricted manner, meaning that there wouldn't be restrictions on their ability to then commercialize those, the outputs or the models that they generate based on use of those data sets to address inherent bias issues. Cheryl, do you have thoughts?
I would only echo exactly what you said about the training data specifically, that opportunity to have a data set that it matches the real world distributions and it is collected and curated to appropriate to the circumstance is just, it is golden to have that. The trick for data scientists and practitioners who are building and using the models, though, is that it sometimes isn't enough. You still have to dig deeper into what types of bias your model might demonstrate, because that data that you need to be fully unbiased may not be available. An example of this is survivor bias, what's called survivor bias. And where that means that data is only available for survivors of some process. So the word survivor can be taken literally in a medical domain, where the long-term effects of treatments can only be predicted for those that live. And that's where the name of that type of bias comes from. But it also applies to building models that try to predict future performance, such as screening job or school applications. And a model can only learn to create patterns that distinguish those who did well from those that didn't within the characteristics that are represented in the data. So the risks that you still have, even with as perfect a data set as you can have, is that a bias in the historical selection process here across gender or race, income, locale, age, those would now be encoded in the model because that's the only data you have.
Thank you, Cheryl. So let's get Peter into the mix as well. So Peter and Ghazal, The degree of risk associated with AI bias can be minor, but it can also be project destroying. So how can lawyers, we as lawyers, in-house, outside counsel, how can lawyers work with data engineers, developers, and product managers to mitigate these risks?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here. I think the first thing I'd say is the makeup of this session really is so important. Having Cheryl on here is really critical, and I think demonstrative of the most important thing in my mind, which is making sure that it's not just a bunch of lawyers huddled in the corner worrying about risk and then going to the business and telling them what they should do after the fact or even before the fact without the right context. Or it's not, a bunch of data scientists or product managers trying to figure this out on their own. It really needs to be collaborative from the very beginning. And so that's one thing that I know is sort of my world working on, and it's hard. It's hard to get those teams to not just build policies and procedures that address bias, which is, if it hasn't been said, is going to be present in every model. There will not be a bias-free model, right? So the degree of bias is going to vary, but it's always going to be there. And so I think fundamentally in starting out, it's a matter of education, really, making sure that the product teams, the data science teams understand why this matters and what it is for the business that they're working within. And that lawyers also understand as much as possible the process that those teams are going through when they're building these products, so that we can design our policies and our kind of run books to make sure that they're actually going to work in practice. Because if we just write a bunch of legal policies that say, avoid these types of inputs and these use cases and go and make sure you don't hurt anybody, that's going to be pretty useless, right? We really need to make sure there's sort of active engagement throughout and constant communication between legal, data science, product, to make sure that it is workable and is really, really, something that can be implemented. One other thing I'd say, which is kind of a high level point too, is I completely agree with the absolute importance of data in this and data integrity and making sure that it's good data, it's representative data, but it's really, really important that the design folks, product managers and others are also thinking about these issues from the start, because you can have design flaws that can absolutely lead to biased outcomes. And you may have biased assumptions that go into a product design. You may have great data, but if the problem you're trying to solve or the way that you're approaching it has bias built into sort of either the problem question or the hypothesis, that can also create issues. So it's about getting engaged early and making sure that all of these teams are working closely together.
Yeah, I definitely echo that, Peter. I think education about the legal, regulatory, moral, and policy issues among all the rest of the issues that we've faced with, in working with these teams, specifically AI teams, is really critical. And I think most of the data engineers and data scientists that I worked with in the past at AWS, they were quite adept at these topics. But oftentimes we still had to walk them through the challenges and possible solutions for addressing bias at a technical and operational level. So it wasn't enough for us to just understand the legal risks, and it wasn't just enough for us to kind of hone in and be very, very pedantic about the legal issues. It was really having an understanding of how the core technology worked was part and parcel of the job. Like, you couldn't do it if you didn't understand how some of these very complex systems worked, right? Certainly not at the level of Cheryl or the engineers, but you had to have some working knowledge of it. And I know that, for example, my team at AWS, they were actively working on releasing new features that were really intended to help reduce bias in AI systems and introduce greater explainability, partly because they were cued in on these topics, right? And you can, after the presentation, you can look it up. It's called AWS SageMaker Clarify. And that was really because they had a mandate from the top, right? Their leaders had placed an emphasis on that. And we were hearing from customers that was something that was very important to them. So of course, as we were navigating these issues, it really required the product counsel or corporate counsel who were working with these teams to understand the technical constraints, to understand how these services were architected. And also, one thing that we haven't mentioned yet is really data annotation. I think data annotation is a critical component here. I mean, you're literally looking at the data and categorizing it. And depending on how that process is undertaken, you can introduce bias that way. So you can have the greatest data set in the world, might be the most representative, might be the most diverse, might be the most unbiased by all objective standards. But then you have human beings that are exercising their own individual biases. And so, they're, even with the best of intentions, obviously, bias can be introduced into models. Therefore, it's super, super important, to Peter's point, for the technical teams to work very closely with their lawyers to address and monitor these issues as they come up. One final point here that I think is interesting from a legal perspective is the cross-section between privacy and AI bias. It's really interesting as additional jurisdictions are enacting these robust privacy laws. Obviously, they put greater constraints on access to data sets that have sensitive features like gender, age, nationality, and other things. It really becomes a challenge, right? Then you're worried about, well, if I source this data and I use it to train this model, is it going to result in me potentially violating privacy laws, right, in a particular jurisdiction? There are constraints that are placed on, especially now we're seeing it more and more with efforts in multiple jurisdictions. And I think Cheryl will speak to this point later in the presentation, but you're seeing more and more efforts to actually regulate automated decision making, especially in when it involves these sensitive areas for privacy considerations and other legal issues. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for industry and government to work together to try to address how there's cross section of privacy in AI systems.
Thank you both. So they're not making it easy, first of all. That is clear. In-house counsel, you have your work cut out for you. That is transparent. But Peter, you worked at AWS as well. Now you're in healthcare with Change Healthcare. So you've had a breadth of different corporate experiences. What other steps do you think companies can take to reduce the risk of AI bias as an institution?
Sorry, I was fumbling for my unmute button. Yeah, I think it's again, I'm going to go back to data because it's just so central, and it's really data and inputs. But when we're talking about sort of designing these products, and healthcare is an example where you're going to, by necessity, be using inputs and data sets that implicate protected legal classes in many cases, and so that's. For the lawyers, many lawyers on this call know that's where you're going to get into trouble pretty easily. And so I'd say fundamentally one thing that you can do and work with teams and try to build into your policies and sort of build the muscle memory around is essentially using the sort of minimal, the fewest number of inputs as necessary, right? It should not be an exercise, a purely sort of academic exercise in this world of just dumping data in and dumping fields in and inputs in and see what happens, right? I mean, if we don't need to implicate race or gender or an obvious proxy for those or other categories, then we shouldn't. And so that should be really, I think, ingrained. It goes back to education, but it's about the sort of the design and the data that you're using. And so I think building in programs and trainings for folks on the product side and data science side to understand that. But then again, legal should be engaged early. And one way I think to help frame this for companies and organizations and sort of make sure that engagement happens is to make sure that the leadership understands this issue. So that education that I talked about earlier has to be, organization wide, right? You need sort of top-down investment, as Ghazal mentioned at Amazon, where we both worked. There was that. Now, I'll say that top-down investment came in some cases after some embarrassing public incidents, right? And that's often that's what happens, and that's the worst case scenario. And so what we're trying to do is build policies, procedures that help companies, organizations get ahead of that. And to be specific, because I know this is a short session, it's about as far as legal engagement, it's going to be about making sure that there's testing ongoing of these models and making sure that data scientists have the tools and direction to know how to test for bias and how to measure it. But then it's really a legal exercise. We need to document what they did. We need to document how they did it. We need to document not just how they built the model, how they trained it, but then how they tested for bias. What were those outcomes? And then how did they mitigate, right? What were the alternatives, which means more models, right? That performed better. And then make sure that at the end of the day, when you have a bias model, which again, you always will, you can justify the level of bias. And justify that you've done everything you can to mitigate it and to minimize, the impact. And so it's really about documentation. Documentation is the most important thing for me, at least at the end of the day, and that's what we're trying to build out programmatically where I am now to make sure that we can. Not just react as things go bad, but make sure that we're sort of, checking along the way, and then we have the resources and the documents to substantiate our position if necessary.
Thank you so much, Peter. So, I guess it's time for the CLE code. So I'll just announce it right now. For those of you who are on the phone, the CLE code is 63064. 63064. So please enter that into the form, and a form will also be emailed at the end of all of the sessions as well. So thank you, Mike. Okay. So, and thank you, Peter, for your last answer. And Anjelica, I'm coming to you because I am not leaving you out of this conversation. So, as Peter was just talking about in terms of heading things off at the pass, basically getting out in front of things. I know IBM and you have been really focused on putting policies in place to do just that and have a really interesting ranking system to decipher when data is ultimately bias-free. If you can have such a wonderful goal of ultimately being bias-free, can you please tell us about that and what IBM has been doing, because it's so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do it at a very high level, but this bias rating system was developed by our IBM AI research team, and I'll make sure to share the full paper towards the end of the panel. But essentially, the research proposes that an independent 3-level rating system can determine the relative fairness of an AI system by issuing one of 3 rankings. So the first one would be it's not biased. The second would be it inherits the bias properties of its data or training. Or the third rating would be it has the potential to introduce bias, whether the data is fair or not. So from that independent evaluation, the AI end user can determine the trustworthiness of each system based on the level of the bias from that rating system. And what's really interesting, kind of what Peter was mentioning before, this research aligns with that generally accepted AI principle of bias testing and bias mitigation, especially for certain high-risk AI systems and sectors like criminal justice. And what's really interesting is we're starting to see the requirement for testing and assessments play out in the global AI policy landscape. And independent organizations like we're a part of, the World Economic Forum, are starting to develop even certification platforms that leverage a similar rating system model. So hopefully in the next year or two, we'll see this kind of rating system proliferate in other areas or countries and even policies. But I go back to Peter's point, it is about testing, documenting, and I know a little later we'll talk about kind of the impact assessments that we're hearing more and more about.
Great, thank you so much. And Cheryl, we've got a lot of lawyers in the audience today. For those of us who might not come from a technical background, can you help us out by telling us, what questions should we be asking, the data scientists at the company to ensure that our models are reliable? And are there other steps that companies can take on the technical side to reduce this risk of AI bias?
Yeah, sure. It's important to start at the beginning with the training data. Of course, I think we're all beating that same drum here. The data scientists need to understand that what the data has in it and the distributions of the characteristics, particularly those characteristics that have equality and ethical implications. One of the techniques or kind of approaches that Peter referred to is you're using the minimal data set, don't necessarily, don't use race as a factor in your model. And that actually is, it is partitioned into different parts. You need to know those variables so you can test whether your model is biased. So that data, you have to collect that data. You have to know that data. Using it as a direct factor in a model is only useful if you are applying some of the constraint-based controls on the model to correct for that. You already know that bias is there and you can correct for that based on those variables. So there are different ways to use that, but it's very important to know those variables and those distributions and so that you can be able to test for them. So the data scientists should understand that and have access to that and then control for it in their model. Data scientists have to work with the legal teams to know what the model is going to be used for and compare their distributions to that use, and with the legal team decide if that's going to be appropriate or not. In the survivorship example or survivor bias example I gave earlier, if you have that school application, a model, the important question to ask as well is, are you going to use the model to determine how an application would have been treated or how a new application should be treated? It's the same data, and you have a bias problem for using it to determine how a new application should be treated because you've got the historical biases of the processes baked in, but you don't have a bias problem if you're using it to determine how applications would have been treated in terms of in the historical process. So that's why it's very important for the data scientists and the legal team to work together, and not just the legal team, but the product team, knowing what it's going to be used for and is it appropriate. And a final thought on this is that peer review is extremely powerful for this purpose in terms of having your model assessed by an independent evaluator. The training data set should be available for independent assessment, and that can be under NDA as appropriate. Companies should seek these independent evaluations of their data and their models if the testing is available before taking them to production, ideally.
Great, thank you. So we've talked about data scientists, we've talked about in-house counsel, we've talked about product developers. Now, I want to know, though, to really be a company that takes AI bias seriously and is going to be successful at the end of the day, I trust you need a broader organizational approach. And Anjelica, I know that IBM has extensive experience in this area and has really sought to institutionalize AI ethics as an organization as a whole. Can you please tell us how IBM has instituted an AI governance framework to support bias mitigation strategies?
Yeah, so at IBM, we've always tried to prioritize the ethical considerations of the technologies that we're bringing into the market. And we know AI can obviously have a positive impact on the world, making it smarter, healthier, and clearly more prosperous. But we also know that can only happen if society trusts AI. And our approach to AI ethics is focused on strengthening that trust. And one of the things, if you do this, you Google trustworthy AI, IBM comes up because this is a core to our business. In order to address this issue at IBM, we really support a holistic organizational and cultural change internally at our company. And so a few years ago, IBM put in place a centralized and multidimensional AI governance framework that's centered around an IBM internal AI ethics board, which is co-led by our chief privacy officer and our chief artificial intelligence officer. And what that does is it supports both the technical and non-technical initiatives, but also the folks, so bringing the lawyers, the data scientists, the developers, all to the table to help operationalize IBM's principles of trust and transparency before we're putting these products on the market or giving them to our clients. Additionally, to support the bias mitigation strategies, we're consistently advocating for organizations outside IBM and with our clients to create implement and operationalize AI ethics principles, and just making sure that governance is in place to do ongoing review of these products and provide oversight of these systems. Because, as Cheryl said earlier, you can never eliminate bias. It is going to show up, but it's clear you need to test, assess, and consistently audit these systems. And that's what this governance structure really helps to do, is to catch it, document it, as Peter said, and make sure everybody's on the same page about where you're moving forward to mitigate that bias moving forward.
Great, thank you. So everybody who's participating today should know that Ghazal, unfortunately, is going to have to get off a couple minutes early at the end. So I want to get your thoughts, Ghazal, certainly now. First, I'd love to hear how leaders in your companies have really also taken an active role in AI bias mitigation, and just any additional tips that you might have otherwise, key takeaways or best practices for folks before you have to go.
Yeah, and so sorry about that, scheduling conflicts in work from home life. To touch on the role of leaders, I mean, leaders play an integral role in defining what taking very strong principled positions and then reviewing their product roadmaps with explainability and bias mitigation and addressing some of these inherent AI related bias issues. At AWS, for example, they were really focused on solving for these common AI problems. AI was a big focus of the business overall. There was a ton of resources and time and engineering and a lot, kind of put into play to address and make sure that we were launching good products that were going to be, addressing our customers' needs. But they definitely had a focus on explainability, definitely had a focus on bias mitigation. So the product roadmap was really developed with those principal tenets in mind. It also impacted what our engineers and academics, we had a lot of PhDs, wrote about both privately and publicly, right? And these were in customer-facing documents like blogs and white papers, and also technical resources. And so the entire organization was really focused on finding solutions for this problem. And it honestly would not have happened but for leaders putting the right sort of emphasis on it. Whether that was defined after the fact, right, where you had this maybe some controversy that came up because of something that was released, or you then adopted proactive solutions to address it going forward. One thing I can't overemphasize enough is really the goal or the role of government in all of this. I mean, we're hearing a lot of talk about oversight and regulatory models that are thought about and have been worked on by governments around the world. And really, the goal here, and my personal view on it, is that those should not encroach on the development or innovation of the technology. The answer can't be to eliminate AI altogether. If there is a specific issue, for example, if use of facial recognition by certain actors like police or law enforcement is an issue, then the government should legislate that use rather than legislating the technology overall or at the corporate level. So really, government needs to come around to the idea that AI is not going to unlock this dystopian Big Brother future that's become popularized in media and Hollywood, but really it has a lot of potential for to help human advancement. We saw this with applications of AWS AI technologies in the fight against sex trafficking and finding missing and exploited children. I mean, there's so many amazing opportunities for people to benefit from it, and for consumers, not just companies, to benefit from it. And I think right now it's getting overshadowed by a lot of fear mongering and frankly, a misunderstanding of how the technology works. Like I said, we as lawyers would not have had the ability to advise on a lot of these AI issues if we didn't have a fundamental understanding of the technology. And you can't legislate or regulate something if you don't have a fundamental understanding of the technology. So it's really coming together and figuring out, how can we usher in a new age of responsible AI for the benefit of all. In fact, Anjelica today, who's the current CEO of Amazon, and Peter and I were in the room when our teams would pitch ideas to Andy when he was the CEO of AWS. I mean, he spoke about this today. I think appropriate regulation is certainly something that most industry will get behind. I think that so long as it doesn't stifle innovation and so long as the focus isn't on fear mongering, right? It's not on like this very dystopian view of how AI could evolve and take over the world. I mean, we're so far from generalized artificial intelligence. It's funny. So Yeah, I think that's critical. And then the last point I'll make, and I'll let the other panelists speak to this issue, is really, again, emphasizing the role of education, making sure that in-house lawyers are really taking the time to talk to their teams, make sure that they're cued in on some of the issues that we're concerned about, and ensuring that they're on board. Data sourcing, which I think we've touched on quite a bit. And then this issue of testing and retraining is so critical. And one thing that we haven't touched on is really no AI system is 100% perfect. So human review is still incredibly important, especially when you're releasing models into production that are going to be used to predict sensitive outcomes. So if it's going to impact somebody's ability to secure a home loan, or it's going to impact their health outcomes, then there shouldn't be over reliance on automated decision making. It really should involve human review.
Great. Thank you so much, Ghazal. And I'll just thank you because I know you'll evaporate at some point. So thank you so much for joining us today. So one of the really important issues that Ghazal just touched on, of course, is what role the government should play with respect to AI bias solutions. And, in the beginning of this presentation, we also talked about data, and how, most corporations get their data from either, a corporate source or an academic source. And we talked about some of those limitations, because of course, academia is resource constrained. And of course, corporations are looking at limited customer sets. So Peter, I'm hoping you can build a bridge between these two issues and tell us, what do you think the role of government should be in terms of helping to solve this data problem that we have, and releasing guidance around data sharing between public and private organizations to ensure data integrity by allowing for the curation of a more diverse set of data to create fairer solutions going forward?
Yeah, I think it's critical, and I think everyone's touched on it, that it's going to be super important that we have more and more, not just more and more data. We will, of course, but more and more curated data, more better process around annotation, around compilation, and generally regulations, ultimately, if not guidance, at least that can increase the general quality of some of these larger, certainly publicly available data sets. And then collaboration between the public and private sector is always going to be critical. And I mean, the ultimate goal here should be to, as Ghazal was getting at, to in Jess's comments, promoting innovation. This should be, despite the things that can go wrong and despite the bad headlines that have happened, this is ultimately really transformative technology that, has much more potential for good than I think is acknowledged. And I would argue much more potential for good than bad. And so I think, particularly in the area of bias, we need to, I think, recognize that there are actually many applications of AI that can create much less biased outcomes than a typical human review would have. And so we can replace, human bias with, in some cases, less bias and algorithmic bias, but it can be used in that way to really, I think, make things better. We need to sort of start to shift the dialogue a bit to try to make sure that it's, we're educating policymakers and getting them to buy in on AI. And I think they have. I think now it's just a matter of getting a coherent approach and finding the right body to do it. But I think making sure that there's a sort of a consistent wave toward promoting this technology and fostering it, investing in it. And the data is a huge part of that.
Thank you so much. So, Anjelica, with all of your great governmental background, I want to make sure you're going. Bye, Ghazal. You have the opportunity to speak to this as well. Any thoughts that you have in terms of the proper role for government and what it can do to reduce bias overall? And the other thing too, I just want to make sure we have time for you to cover, because it's so interesting and evolving and going on now, and we're waiting for news any second. In terms of more regulation. So we've been watching these legal developments around the world with respect to potential AI legislation, really worldwide. And this could have a significant impact on US companies, even if it's implemented solely abroad. Can you please give us your great expertise in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little over a year ago, IBM outlined its precision regulation approach to IBM to continue fostering innovation while placing safeguards on problematic use cases of AI technology. So we offered 3 principles for governments and companies looking to move AI regulation forward. And those included that we proposed different rules for different use cases, requiring transparency, and taking a co-regulatory approach to AI testing. Now, fast forward to May of this year, as a result of some of the renewed attention to inequities and the way that the technology can be misused to exacerbate injustice among marginalized groups, we called on policymakers to work together with industry to address human bias and discrimination in AI. So the IBM point of view on mitigating AI bias lays out 5 policy recommendations that IBM is urging governments to prioritize to strengthen adoption of testing, impact assessments, and mitigation strategies that can minimize the occurrences of bias in AI systems. And those 5 principal recommendations included promoting AI literacy throughout society, requiring assessments and testing for high-risk AI systems, requiring developers and owners to disclose to users when they're interacting with AI technologies, requiring methods for consumers to provide insights and feedback, and finally, establishing universal use limitations of AI. And then as a part of that commitment and advocacy, we've also made sure that we're sharing some of our open source tools, such as our AI Fairness 360 toolkit and our AI fact sheets. And I'll happy to share those towards the end of the panel. Now, with regards to regulation, where we are, so I'll start with the US. Right now, there's not really a whole lot of activity going on. However, the Algorithmic Accountability Act, which was introduced last year, is likely to be reintroduced this fall. And the legislation is designed to combat AI bias, and it would require tech companies to regularly audit high-risk AI systems. It's also received public endorsement from the newly appointed FTC Commissioner, Rebecca Slaughter. So we should definitely see some fireworks going when this gets introduced, but I don't see anything passing this year. I'm going to skip over the EU for a second, but I'll talk about Brazil and Korea real quick. So Brazil introduced a bill that would establish a legal framework for the use of artificial intelligence in their government, companies owned and operated, and individuals within the country. So under the framework, an AI agent would be tasked to ensure that any use of the technology is in compliance with their country's general data protection law, or Brazil's own GDPR. The AI agents will also be required to produce an impact report or an impact assessment that provides risk management and containment measures. Now, the thing with this assessment is that it has to be delivered to the government and shared publicly. So that's a flag. It's currently, we'll see activity this fall when Brazil's Congress comes back in session. So that's something to monitor. In Korea, in June, a member of the Korea's ruling party hosted a public hearing and discussed some proposed legislation to establish a framework act on AI. Now, what's interesting about this is that normally a hearing is not conducted prior to the introduction of legislation in the National Assembly of Korea. So it's very clear this is an important hot topic for them. And the reason why I flagged this one is that based on my preliminary review of the legislation, there's some areas that might warrant our audience to monitor, specifically Article 24, which includes investigations of potential instances of bias or violations of this law. And it effectively includes access to data, access to source code, and on-site inspections. And if you are found in violation, Articles 28 and 29 list out a great deal of penalties that the company or organization will pay for that. So I definitely encourage you to look into these. And then lastly is the creme de la creme, the European Union, which has released their proposal for regulation for artificial intelligence, or the AI Act. And this really addresses AI bias, among other things, and provides regulations to ensure AI compatibility with fundamental rights. And generally, this has been welcomed across the tech community. There are some concerns just about the nuances of the definitions of high risk, because in the regulation, it's classified into 4 categories, namely unacceptable, high, limited, and minimal risk. And then they've also identified high risk sectors, such as financial services and human resources, which would require those sectors to adhere to these regulations once finalized. So we'll see more activity with that, but really the EU is leading in this space. And most of the AI companies leading in this space are based in the US. So we'll have to watch. The US really, NIST is probably going to take the lead with the framework that they're working on, the risk management framework. There's an RFI that's been out that they're seeking comments on. And so if your clients or you as an organization want to provide input, all of these countries have done consultations. Korea had one that ended, but the assembly is still taking comments on it. So if you have an issue with source code being shared, definitely provide comment. But that's the best way to get engaged on this, is for your organizations, clients, or companies to definitely be vocal about what some of the challenges are. And what's been great is that they're listening. They're making those adjustments to make sure that this doesn't impede on innovations in AI and isn't too prescriptive and too, it doesn't eliminate opportunities to advance this technology in certain countries.
Thank you so much. I think the headline there is potential dawn raids of bias incidents going forward in Korea. So I know we're technically at the end of our time, but I think we probably have just a couple minutes, because I'd love for you guys each, quickly just give whatever top takeaways or best practices you think our audience should be aware of before they transition to their next panel.
Sure. One, I just want to second everything Anjelica just said about regulation. I think it's super critical that companies get directly engaged wherever you're operating. In the US, I think the NIST RFI is a fantastic and maybe only real opportunity right now. And so I think that's really critical. I think my main takeaway too, connected with that, is that the reason to think about these issues early, and the reason to build out a really robust framework of policies and procedures to address them, and which include testing, and which include auditing, and which include regular independent review, is because you're more likely going to be required to do that at some point. You're not required to do it in many cases right now. You being different companies, whatever your use may be. But regulation is coming. Whether it comes at the federal level in the US is a big question, but it will come at the state level. It already is. It will probably, in the absence of federal legislation, model after the EU. And so we will have these requirements coming. And I think companies certainly are best served by building these frameworks like IBM has and other large companies have. And where I am Change, we are doing the same to try to get ahead of this and to really make sure that when these rules come out, even if we're not exactly lined up, we've got a massive head start. So that's kind of my biggest takeaway is this shouldn't be just sort of a academic exercise, and it really needs to be something that gets attacked kind of practically and at a policy level inside organizations.
Great.
And I have just a couple of quick takeaways. Know your data. Your model's going to do exactly what your data tells it to do. So it's completely knowable what your model will do. The great thing about models, and unless you are retraining them, they're going to do exactly the same thing over and over and over and over again. So test. And that you can determine what the model will do if you give it enough tests ahead of time to understand what the bias is.
Thank you. Anjelica, a final word from you if you want to add anything in takeaways.
Yeah, I would just say, thinking about impact assessments is really important because pretty much every piece of legislation is going to talk about this. And what's interesting is they don't define what's in it. So I think the legal legal community has a great opportunity to kind of describe what's acceptable, what is acceptable risk for your client or company as it relates to these impact assessments. I also think from a legal mitigation perspective, getting consumer feedback is really important, and we've advocated for that, requiring that. But I think even before mandating it in law, that's something the community needs to think about, because you can, before this gets public, as Peter said, there's been cases. If you're getting the feedback internally, you can work collectively with legal, your developers, to mitigate the bias that's been identified. And the last thing is just the governance aspect. Like we said, trying to stand up your ethics board, as Peter said, getting those policies and procedures in. We're going through a whole organizational change. We're putting in new corporate directives at our company around AI ethics. So I think that's the big thing here, is just the impact assessments, getting that consumer feedback, and getting your governance from an AI ethics standpoint in place.
Great. Fantastic. I just want to thank all of you. You were all terrific, of course. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who joined us. And I know you've got another panel, so I'll let you go. But thanks again. I really enjoyed this.